Thank you, Mary. I do feel a bit like a stand-up comedian with a microphone here, which is unfortunate because, of course, we have Robin Ince and Natalie Haynes here, and they can show us how it's really done. So I look a bit silly from that point of view. The other thing is that, following on from the previous speaker, as a stand-up comedian, it's a bit like having Bernard Manning follow Alexei Sayle or something. You're having a philosopher after this scientist. So anyway, I shall try not to be too appalling. Now, a little bit of background to this talk. Humanism is in an interesting position, and a gathering of humanists or an organisation of humanists is in an interesting position compared to a lot of others. And actually, I think one which is comparable to a position that a gathering of philosophers or an institution of philosophers might be in. Now, I spent 13 years editing the Philosopher's magazine. Now, if you have virtually any special interest magazine, then its job is really partly cheerleading. It's to sort of say how great things are, how wonderful it is, and to sort of, talk up to the readership, singing to the choir. But I always felt this was slightly inappropriate for a philosophy magazine because, after all, philosophy is meant to pride itself on its intense questioning, its skepticism, its scrutiny, and that should apply to itself. So it always seems something suspicious to me when philosophers are too keen to say how great philosophy is. That seems to be, surely they should be the people who are sort of like keen to look at themselves and go, but it's not great in all respects maybe, and there's a possibility that maybe what we're doing is just nonsense. The critics could be right, could be spinning in the wind. We could be completely on the wrong track. Now, humanism is in a similar position, I think. What are humanists? What are the characteristics that humanists pride themselves in? Well, being reasonable, being rational, taking a cold, hard look at the world and seeing it for what it is. And if that's true, which I hope it is, then it would be very surprising if, lo and behold, every time we look on sort of our side of the fence, we see that everything is lovely and wonderful and everything the other side is awful. I think that humanism should be capable of appreciating its limitations, of appreciating any losses that may go along with being a humanist life, and to give credit to alternatives where it's due. It should also be capable, of course, of handling dissent in a reasonable way. I think generally, of course, it is, but I have to say I've been a little bit dismayed sometimes by some of the tone of debate between people who dissent within atheism. The recent debate, of course, has been largely about whether or not people think certain forms of advocacy of atheist and humanist outlooks are too belligerent, to whatever it may be. And I think, unfortunately, there are people on both sides of that debate who have, in disagreeing with their colleagues, perhaps allowed that disagreement to get a bit too heated and personal and not to sort of take it for a constructive challenge that it could be. But the subject I wanted to focus on today was just more about religion and whether there are any sort of losses of unbelief. Now, I don't think, it's a question worth asking. And of course, right from the beginning, I want to say that if there are losses, then so be it. These are not reasons for being religious or becoming religious. I think ultimately, the reasons for not being religious are that, it doesn't stack up one way or another. It's a bit more complicated than that. I mean, I'm tempted to say the reason for that is that religion is false. But of course, even that's quite complicated because, as we know, it's false to the extent to which it makes factual claims about the world. But religion does many other things as well as make factual claims about the world, which therefore make it maybe misguided or something, but not necessarily false. And also there are plenty of people who will try and go stronger and say that religion's not really about making factual claims about the world at all. I think that's sometimes true, although I think that view is massively overstated by people who want to make religion seem reasonable in the modern world. It seems to be wishful thinking, as a lot of people claim, to say that religion is all about mythos and not about logos, which is the way they normally put it. That it's just a fundamental mistake to think that the Bible makes any kind of factual claims. Well, I'm afraid I know a lot of Christians, for example, even very intelligent, very smart, in lots of ways very liberal Christians who still have the empty tomb as their bottom line. There is a very, very precise factual claim there. So when I'm saying that I think there might be, we have to consider whether there are things we lose when we give up a religious life. That's not to say, and so maybe we should, reconsider and become religious ourselves. It's simply in the name of honesty, and also to appreciate the limitations of our lives a bit more. Now, I think some of these are easier than others, if you like. If you take the large one, which is the general theme of this weekend, meaning and value, I think I'll leave it to other speakers and other sessions to really explain why that's not really a fundamental problem. But I think even here there are two brief points worth making. First of all, on one side, that it is, of course, odd that a lot of people believe that these things are unproblematic if you're religious. In the book I did on the meaning of life, I used the example of Frankenstein and his creature. Now, it's almost like people think that having been created by a great God or something, this means that meaning is just given. But, the creature created by Frankenstein, in what sense does his existential needs be satisfied merely from the fact that he was created with a purpose by a creator? We always have a problem about whether or not we take on for ourselves the purposes of our creator. So that's just a small example of how actually these things aren't as straightforward for religious people anyway. But I would just like to sort of again inject a little small note of caution about this, because I think that sometimes it's so frustrating hearing people wheel out the normal nonsense about, how if there's no God, then everything is permitted, and how can you find meaning, how can there be any meaning in a purposeless universe? That I think it's very easy to sort of overcompensate. We know what the answers are, we know what the sources of meaning are, and we know that it's perfectly possible to have a good, meaningful life without God. But at the same time, I think if we're honest, we have to accept the fact that we shouldn't be too pat about that. We shouldn't sort of like pretend that things are all jolly. I do think a honk if you don't love Jesus bumper sticker is antithetical to the true critical spirit of humanism. Because the fact of the matter is, finding meaning and living a rich life in a world without God, with mortality, with no second chances, is fraught, and it leads to we can fail. There are people who just have horrible, awful lives and they die, and there is no redemption. There are people who strive to live good lives and they fail, and there is no redemption. And and there is sometimes, I think, most people are, at least at sometimes, despite the fact that normally we know there are ways of getting on with life and enjoying it and enriching it and appreciating it, when things do seem pretty futile. So I think we have to accept the fact that the good answers that we can give to why there is meaning and value in life without God shouldn't be seen as too pat. And we have to accept the fact that this doesn't mean that everyone has a meaningful life. It doesn't mean that we don't fail, and there's a lot of failure and there's a lot of disappointment without redemption. So there you go. I'm being very cheerful, aren't I? I think I better, you'll be wanting to get to lunch straight away, or maybe I'll be putting you off. Another one I think is very odd is people often accuse humanists and atheists of lacking a sense of mystery. They strip the mystery out of life. I won't spend much time on this because this is just nonsense. I mean, life is full of mystery. You don't need to create. You don't need to invent new mysteries, about like transubstantiation or something. There are enough mysteries in, consciousness, quantum physics theory. I mean, it's baffling, Robin's colleague on the Infinite Monkey Cage, what's his name? That Cox fella, he did that series, full of mystery, awe, wonder, and so forth. So I think this is just one we can dismiss quite easily. I think the problem here is that the interesting question, I guess, is why people think this is true. Why do people think this is true? And again, maybe it's because of a bit of overcompensation on our part. That it's sort of like there is a tendency perhaps to, in talking up, say, science as a scientific understanding of the world as a better alternative to a religious one, that maybe come over, maybe some even believe we're more in awe of what science can do than we should be. But maybe I'm going back to the previous talk. But in a sense, there is no real problem there. This one, though, is an interesting one as well. That people say that the problem with the humanist outlook is it makes man the measure of all things, and this is hubristic, false, and wrong. I don't know where people kind of get that idea. Although sometimes I do actually, I say that, but I have seen people quote this approvingly from an atheist or humanist perspective. You've got to understand this very, very carefully, what it might mean to say man is the measure of all things. I'm using the traditional gendered version, I'm afraid, but one takes it to be, in this case, referring to ladies as well. There you go. I'm not sexist. I just look like it. Now, my picture is here of US Space and Rocket Center, because, of course, this is a very clear example of how no one thinks man is a measure of all things in important ways. In order to get a rocket to the moon, okay, you have to design the rocket in accordance with laws of nature which are entirely independent of human will and human understanding. Now, that is a very obvious fact, which I think can be obscured by all sorts of nonsense. I mean, for example, let's think about, philosophy of science. Now, there are various ways of understanding science and saying, science has to be seen as a human construction, right? It's something that doesn't exist objectively independently of human beings. It's a kind of a modeling we do of the world. Do not confuse science with an objective, impersonal understanding of the world. Well, I don't want to go into details of that. There are ways of understanding that which do make sense, okay? But you have to be very careful what you take from that. It doesn't, of course, follow, even if science is a human construction in a very, very important way, it doesn't mean that what it is constructing a model of is just, is entirely dependent on us and has no independent reality. The scientific theories are only going to work if they manage to, in some ways, track a real world independent of us. Okay, and I think that's fairly straightforward. I'm making sort of big sweeping philosophical points here, but I think this is an obvious one we shouldn't miss. So in general, stripping God out of the equation and relying upon our own wits and intelligence to understand the universe does not mean we think in that ridiculous way that man is a measure of all things, that there is nothing we are answerable to in our knowledge other than our own wills and our own desires. Our understanding is answerable to the world in very, very concrete ways. And, getting a rocket to the moon is one of the most obvious ways in which it's answerable to the world. But one could even argue that our values are answerable to the world in subtler ways. So these are a few things which I think are a bit more straightforward. There are caveats, there are provisos, etc., etc. But we can pretty much see that despite charges made, there's not really any serious issue of loss. On some other things, I think there are perhaps things we should take more take more seriously. This is something I think is interesting. Various people have taken independent interest in this and written about it in different perspectives. Things like senses of gratitude and humility. This is a Day of the Dead display in Mexico, by the way, in case you're wondering what that has to do with it. Now, the point about this is, of course, the Day of the Dead and such things are rituals which are rooted in, well, actually, Dead is very interesting because it's rooted in both sort of folk religion and the marriage between folk religion and Roman Catholicism, and also just folk practices, not necessarily religion as such. But there is that kind of rich set of traditions and rituals which a culture have developed in order to think about the dead. And it is really about celebrating life. The Day of the Dead is a very sort of joyous occasion. There's feasting, and people visit the graves of ancestors and give feasts there. But they basically have a big party together. It's a ritual, though. It's a ritual which comes out of a religious tradition, and it also does involve, or has involved historically at its roots, it has certain beliefs which, don't really survive scrutiny in the 21st century about, you are with your ancestors. Now, these things can change their meaning over time, of course. So a lot of people who participate in these ceremonies now may do so in an entirely secular way. But what's quite interesting about that is that we don't have many such things like that here, where we've managed to have these very strong things which are completely stripped of their religious meaning. They still keep going. Now, in a roundabout way, what I'm trying to get at is that there are certain things around the ritualization, in particular, and which make certain things, I think, easier to be appreciated within a religious life. Now, take gratitude as an example. Gratitude is, I think, something that you can intellectually, I can give a very straightforward case as to why, gratitude is an appropriate emotion to feel and why we should remind ourselves of it. We should be, thankful that we're alive. We should be thankful for the good things in life, if indeed we have those things, of course. If we don't, then maybe not. If we're living absolutely miserable lives, perhaps we shouldn't feel gratitude. And I think it's a real problem, actually, that there isn't enough of that kind of thing. I am going to sound like a bit of an old fogey here, but I do think that it's really a problem for our culture that gratitude has been replaced more by feelings of entitlement. So, now, rather than thinking, my word, I'm really lucky to have had these 2 weeks in Greece, people are thinking, I'm really unlucky because I haven't had 6 months traveling the world, and that kind of thing. I think this is a problem. So I think that an appropriate sense of gratitude is important. And one can give an entirely secularized case for why that is so. It goes back to its roots are in simply having a proper appreciation for what is good in life. I mean, this is kind of a root humanist thing. But nevertheless, why is it then that if it is that straightforward, that perhaps sense of gratitude does seem to have been eroded? Well, I think this is partly because there are certain ways of maintaining that sense of gratitude which come much more naturally within a religious life. Partly it's because of ritualization, of course. That's perhaps the biggest thing. Saying grace before a meal is something in a way I really approve of. Of course, I don't approve of the wording. I don't think people are right to think they should be thanking some supernatural being. But a ritual of reminding yourself on a daily basis that you are fortunate to have the things in front of you is tremendously helpful. Now, the thing is, you could do that in a secular way. I think it would feel a bit kind of fake, a bit kind of, wouldn't I? I kind of do it internally. I try and do these kind of things internally, remind myself of things. But, if you was to sort of like, I don't know if anyone does it. It'd be interesting to hear if anyone does. Before having a meal, say, before we eat, let's just remind ourselves how thankful we are. I mean, it doesn't have you can see what it's like for these people who sort of defend the beauty and the majesty of religious ritual. They have a point, don't they? It just doesn't sound the same. It doesn't have the same weight as, thank thee, O Lord, for these thy blessed gifts or something. And of course, in going to church and giving thanks in prayer. So I think the way in which gratitude is ritualized and becomes a very natural part of life means that it's something that it's easier to keep in mind if you have a religious life than a non-religious one, I think. Also, of course, it helps that you have something to direct that gratitude towards, because there is a problem when you say gratitude. Well, thankful to who? To what? Now, I don't think that's necessary. I think one can feel thankful and grateful without needing to feel thankful or grateful towards something. But the very fact that the grammar of those phrases, the semantics of those phrases suggests something to be grateful towards, again, it shows why perhaps it doesn't come quite so naturally to people who don't have a God to say, cheers, mate, to others who are just having a generalized sense of good fortune, if you like. So with those two things, someone to direct your gratitude towards and rituals of gratitude means that these things come more naturally. And I think so other perhaps virtues which are like that too. Humility might be one. Now again, I don't think humility is to say religions don't have a monopoly on humilities is understate it, because there are, of course, huge risks. It's always the atheists and humanists who are accused of hubris, and yet, we're not the ones claiming to know the mind of God, for goodness sake. or or whatever it might be. But nevertheless, there are certain aspects of humility, again, because A, you have someone to feel humble in comparison with. I mean, take God out of the equation. Who's much better than you? I mean, who's going to make you feel really humble when they walk into the room? Yeah, Nelson Mandela, of course. He makes everyone feel humble. There might be a few others, but everyone else, Mother Teresa, yeah, she was, we've read Peter Hitchens' book on that, we know she's not that great. No one's all great, are they? Even the people who we think are fantastic, they've all got their flaws. It turns out they've, laundered a bit of money or had an affair on the side or something. There's simply a very few human beings who can inspire that sort of deep humility, reminders of how our own failings. If you've got a God up there, then you've got someone who's constantly making you feel inferior in comparison, I think. And in a way, that's a good thing, right? I mean, I seriously believe this. In a way, it's a good thing. We need humility. We need to remember what our limits are. And we don't have that. And we also don't have the rituals of humiliating ourselves in front of things. So I do think that these are things. What's the point of appreciating these? As I said, this isn't because these are reasons for saying, well, okay then. So although we don't believe in the metaphysics, this is why we have to start going to church, and this is why we need religion, because this is the way a lot of people argue who have these kind of, as I say, I alluded to them earlier, rather sophisticated, non-literal views of religion, which actually I kind of respect in lots of ways. I just don't think they have much to do with what religion actually is for most people. And they do kind of rather disguise the true reality of religion on the ground. But it might be argued that because of this kind of thing, that's why we kind of need religion, and humanists and atheists are naive and foolish to think that we can just get rid of it. You don't have to believe it, just do it, okay? It has its benefits. Now, I don't think that follows, although, as I say, although it doesn't follow, it does make me understand people who do persist with a religious form of life, having basically the same beliefs about the nature of the universe as the majority of people in this room. I think we do have to respect that, and I kind of do see the point of it. I think particularly for people who have a strong emotional connection with that because they've grown up with it, they feel part of a community. We do see it more in Judaism as well, I think, in particular. I mean, Judaism seems to have a particularly strong strand of secular Judaism, atheist Jews, and it seems to be easier for various reasons actually to reconcile having no metaphysical beliefs essentially in God whatsoever, and yet still practicing something of what is seen as the Jewish faith. And there are forms of Christianity where that's kind of possible too. So that's kind of okay, right? So that's a way to understand that, and that's fine. But I don't. It's not something to advocate necessarily, but I do think it's useful and perhaps important to recognize this is something we might have an issue with, because if these things are important, if sense of humility and gratitude are important, and it is genuinely the case that it doesn't perhaps come so naturally, well, then we have to sort of try and do our best to do other things, to keep these things to the fore, to promote these virtues in ourselves. We have to make perhaps more of an effort than we would have to make. So there's a kind of a compensation that has to be done. Giving up God doesn't come completely cost-free, perhaps, that it does require a few efforts to be made. Transcendence is another one. Transcendence. Do other people have a problem with that word? I have a bit of a problem with it because it keeps getting invoked by people who are trying to often, claim something that is vital and important about human life, which is missed in a purely secular worldview. And they say transcendence, and it's a universal human need for transcendence, and it becomes very slippery when people actually try and explain what it is. Well, they try and make it unslippery. I mean, basically, the way most people gloss it is to say transcendence is about going over and beyond the particularities of our own experience, to partake in something greater than ourselves. And people argue that, and again, in a rather slippery way, again, often find the same people who kind of admit that you can have that in a secular context, then end up sort of like suggesting that you can't quite, or it's not as good in the secular context. This is actually quite important. Let me get a bit of an aside here, but it is an important one. This has come up in the controversy over the comprehensive soldier fitness program in the US Army. I don't know if people are following this, because it's actually been quite a big issue amongst the American atheists and humanists, because basically inspired by and actually directed a lot by the work of Martin Seligman, the positive psychologist, the US Army have tried to introduce this program which they call Comprehensive Soldier Fitness, in which they're trying to basically look at the emotional resilience and strengths of their soldiers as well as their physical fitness, because they believe that, you know, it basically makes for a more effective fighting force, and B, you know, reduces problems like post-traumatic stress or something if they can make sure that their soldiers have these good emotional skills as well as the physical strength and skills. And so as part of this comprehensive soldier fitness program, they basically assess the mental well-being and strengths, the fitnesses, as they call them, of the soldiers. And one of them they have was called spiritual fitness. Now, the choice of word was deeply unfortunate. Seligman insists that by spiritual, he doesn't presume religion. And really, when you ask him to explain what he means then by spiritual, if it's not something religious, the T word comes back. It's transcendence. It's the sense of participating in and belonging to something greater than oneself. That's his definition. That thing can be if it's religion, if you're religious. It could be God if you believe in that. But it could be something like, you know, the benefit of humanity. It could be the community you're in. It doesn't need to be something religious. So that all sounds very harmless then, doesn't it? So this is fine, so there's no problem. Well, I mean, first of all, I think that what's happened in the practical example of comprehensive soldier fitness is perhaps indicative of the way this tends to go, because in practice, it does seem to be the case. There's quite a lot of evidence that, in fact, the spiritual fitness test was interpreted by people who had the job of implementing it and so forth as really entailing something religious. So people who scored low in it, failed it essentially, were like referred to chaplains and things in order to sort out their problems. And I've got first-hand testimony of this, about this. I spent some time in America talking to lots of atheists, actually. I should do a plug. I've got an article coming out in the Financial Times shortly on this, and very interesting stuff from some soldiers there. Now, this slippage just seems to happen. You know, it wasn't in the official write-up. It wasn't officially meant to be about religion. Transcendence was defined in this secular way, but somehow it slips and it kind of becomes religious. Now, why is that? There are obviously cultural factors, because you're talking about a country and a culture which is deeply religious. Those are its defaults. But I think it's also because perhaps, and this is perhaps the deeper point, that actually, you know, the secularized versions of transcendence are kind of weaker and thinner than the religious ones. They're kind of not, to say they're not really transcendence is perhaps going too far, but they're just not as strong. You do not achieve transcendence in the secular ways in the same real, you know, perhaps more stronger way that you do with religion, because in religion you have a genuine and abiding sense of participating in something which is objectively greater than us. Objectively, it's as great as it could be. It's the immortal, the eternal, the all-loving, the all-knowing, whatever it might be. You don't get much more transcendent than that. And it is something which is not just a feeling of transcendence, therefore. If you are able to connect with that, if you believe you have a relationship with that and you believe it's real, you believe you're not just having an experience of transcendence, you're actually genuinely participating in a transcendent realm. That's really strong. Now, if you look at the secular forms of transcendence, they don't really stack up in the same way. You get those kind of momentary feelings of transcendence. So people talk about certain feelings you can get through aesthetic experience. There are times where you're listening to a particular piece of music, for example, and you are transported. You have this sense of connecting with something which is, above the here and now, something sublime, something beyond you. But this is fleeting. And we also appreciate that this is a feeling. We don't conclude from this that there is some Platonic form of whatever, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which is really eternal and we are genuinely partaking of it. We accept it's a feeling. The other things which are greater than ourselves are, again, if we look at them, they don't have the same, humanity, for example. I mean, some people would say they achieve their transcendence through a commitment to humanity. But this is a problem. Humanity is an abstract concept. I really have troubles with that. I can't really feel that I have a connection with humanity. There are only, I don't understand so much Margaret Thatcher here, but there's no such thing as humanity. There are only a load of humans. I think that's kind of true. I think it's a mistake to think of humanity as some kind of abstraction, and we're not eternal, we're not infinite. Again, I refer to Brian Cox again, as he told us also eloquently, we're not going to be around forever. So all these things which are greater than ourselves, which we can partake in and participate in, which can apparently give us a sense of transcendence, they don't really match up to the religious sense of transcendence. So from that point of view, and here's the if indeed a sense of transcendence is a valuable and rich and powerful experience, I think that most people find that you can't get that same thing from with a secular outlook and a secular worldview. Now, again, the answer to that, what follows from that is, well, tough, right? Because I think that if that's true, then either, and it's also true that, unfortunately this transcendent dimension doesn't exist, there's no God, etc. That's just not available to us. I think that's fine, but one should accept it. And one needs to sort of counter not counter the accusation, but say, oh no, we have our transcendence, we have our music, we have our art, we have our, reading book group on Thursday, that's greater than myself. We have to accept the fact that no, we don't. We do lose that, but that's the price you pay for taking a cold hard look at the world and seeing it for what it is, in the same way that you lose other comforts. So I think that's an important one. I will just do a few more. A higher aspiration is something I'll cover quite briefly. Again, I think that when it comes to sort of ethics, I think I'm always very wary to give anything away to the other team. And I don't think this does give anything away to the other team. But you can have a feeling, I believe, that humanity does have a higher aspiration. Your aspiration is a higher, and it's clearer perhaps what it might be if you do believe you can be serving something as marvelous as God. Now, obviously, humanists and atheists can have higher aspirations for themselves and their own self-interest. A lot of people do work selflessly and tirelessly for other goals. But again, rather like transcendence, there are limits to that. You're not talking about how can you compare working to save the eternal souls of your fellow human beings as compared to trying to sort of like help as many out of temporary misery as possible. So I think that it's easier for people to have a sense of higher aspiration with religious belief, but again, unfortunately, they're kind of wrong about what that higher aspiration entails. But here are things where it gets even a bit more tricky. What about belonging in community? Because belonging in community are things you might think that's one of the easier things. I've talked about transcendence and all that, and these things are religious terms in themselves. Surely if you think about belonging in community, these are things which, there's nothing special surely about religion here. You don't lose those things when you go over and you lose a religious view. Well, I'm not so convinced by that at all. I think it's very interesting how, generally speaking, how unsuccessful, atheist and secularist communities have been. We have the ethical societies, Victorian times, early 20th century, late 19th century, which set themselves up very much as, they met on Sundays. They were like churches, but not churches, Very few of them are still functioning today. They kind of whittled away. People didn't feel the same kind of solidarity that they used to. The most strikingly, perhaps the most successful version of that kind of secularized religious community is the Unitarian Church. I don't know if we've got any Unitarians here. Yeah, good for you, Mush. Quite popular. I think it seems to be more popular in America still. I actually went to a Unitarian service when I was in America, and it was very interesting. But and you can see how it's an attempt to kind of maintain that sense of the community that a church has in a secular setting, and for a number of people it really does work. But again, it's interesting that it seems to be the exception rather than the rule. Most people who give up belief in God, like me, I could see why people went to this Unitarian church, but for me it didn't work. It seemed like there wasn't a good enough reason basically for it. There wasn't a good enough reason to be there and to chant these things. When you're going there, I guess for the purpose of community, of creating community, and for the purpose of trying to achieve some social goal, it starts to feel perhaps a bit instrumental. Now, of course, the thing about the religions is that people do get a tremendous sense of belonging and community from their churches, but what's binding them is something which, has an objective reality. It's not just an excuse, right? It's not just we're deciding to come together for common interest. What people feel that the fundamental reason for going is in existence of some religious dimension, some God or something, which in some way creates a very clear rationale. They come together to serve, to pray, whatever it might be. And I think that therefore it's not surprising that religious groups are much more enduring than secular ones. They have an external reason to bond them. And the belonging community they get is tremendously worthwhile. I think this should never be underestimated. And again, I don't know how many people here were previously churchgoers at any times in their lives. I went to church in my teens. I went to a Methodist church in Folkestone. And it was, I would still say now, a wonderful community. I would say the community aspect was much more important than the religious one. If you looked at the people in the church, it was quite clear there's a very wide spectrum of seriousness about religious belief. I think it would be unfair. I'm not saying, I think the majority did have a religious belief for sure. But I'm sure there were some who didn't really at all. And I think there are others for whom, well, they probably did, but that really wasn't fundamentally the reason they were there, if you like. But nevertheless, there were enough of them. You needed enough of them. If everyone had been there just for the community, I don't think it would have bonded. You needed enough people who had some conviction in the core message in order to give it a unity, in particular the minister. If the minister didn't sort of like believe any of this stuff, I'm not sure. Although there's a lay ministry in Methodism, so you get a bit more complicated there. And it was a great community, and it came as a bit of a sadness to myself as I was losing my religious belief. I kind of did have this question: did I want to not go to this church anymore because it had become a source of community to me? I was going away to university, so I had a natural break. I kind of continued going, even though I no longer believe. And I went to university, and I didn't really come back. But I do think this is something that we really do have to accept. Is perhaps the biggest loss, perhaps, of giving up religion is you don't get access to that same thing. Not inevitably. I know people will have counterexamples to that, and I'm sure there are some people in this room who could point to particular communities that they belong to, maybe a Unitarian church, maybe a completely non-religious one, in which they have all the community benefits that people get from church. But I just think, on average, typically, that's harder to come by and less common, and it's something that's cut off from. Now, again, there's nothing that follows from this in terms of what we can do about it, other than to honestly acknowledge the loss. And I think it is also an important thing, though, about understanding why people persist with religion, even if they have doubts about it, and even if they actually have given it up. Also, by the way, it's also, I suspect, it's the reason why a lot of people really persist with religion, even though they also sincerely believe the doctrine. Let me just explain what I mean. A little analogy for you. Let's say you know someone who's an organic gardener, right? They do their garden in an organic way, okay? And you say to them, why is it then why are you organic? And they'll explain to you, they genuinely believe that organic is healthier, safer, better for the planet, etc., etc. So they have their practice, which is their organic gardening, and they have their belief system, which is that organics is the best. Now, I can imagine a situation in which such a person could be convinced that they're actually mistaken about the benefits of organics, and that actually, from a health, environmental, and other point of view, that it's no better at all, okay? I'm saying I can imagine. I'm not saying that's true. I can imagine that being true and someone being convinced. And them turning around and saying, do you know what? I'm going to carry on doing it anyway. Because it turns out they thought their beliefs were much more important than they were. It turns out that they genuinely thought their beliefs in the benefits of organics were behind this. But it actually turns out there's something more intrinsically satisfying to them about trying to manage this garden without the use of chemicals and all that kind of stuff than it is to sort of like throw stuff on it, right? In the same kind of way, in a similar way, I think that perhaps for a lot of people who genuinely do have literal beliefs in things like, truth of the Bible and resurrection, it may be that although they have those beliefs and believe they are important for why they do what they do, that actually what's really motivating them is the practice, and one of the things about that is belonging in community. I should probably wrap up soonish because I should be polite and leave a few times for heckles and questions. I think this is the last thing I want to talk about, which might seem odd, salvation from science. Here we have one of our relations, which is a very cute thing. What do I mean by salvation from science? Maybe it would be nice to talk longer with Peter Atkins about this, because I do think that we're in this odd position in relation to science. I think humanism is an odd position to it, because I think that although, of course, one should welcome science completely and not shy from what it tells us, I don't think, I think in a sense, those early Christians, not early Christians, the Christians who resisted Darwinism at the time kind of had a point. I want to explain the cause because not all of them resisted it. When I say they kind of had a point, it was this, is that they saw in the theory of evolution a threat to, the inherent dignity and worth of humanity. They saw that this would undermine cherished beliefs we have about ourselves. And in a way, I think they could be right. Not that we're descended from the apes per se, that's not such a big deal. But there are lots of reasons to think that science does, I think, challenge certain views about humanity. I mean, think about how, we have an idea of us being rational, self-controlling, conscious beings endowed with free will, able to choose our own destinies. I mean, these are just standard things people say about, what do humanists believe, that we can make these choices for ourselves and that we can do it through reason and so forth. I think there's a lot of stuff coming in through science and neuroscience which undermines that to a certain extent. Now, this is a really complicated issue, and I don't think it undermines it as much as some people glibly say it does. A lot of, you get a lot of articles, books popping up now, which kind of go from like, well, in the lab they've shown that you have the brain sends the signal to move your hand milliseconds before you had the thought that you want to move your hand, right? True finding. That shows we don't have free will, right? Or whatever it might be. The jumps are often too quick and too simplistic. But I also think one can't deny the fact that naive views we might have had about the extent to which we are rational creatures capable of controlling our own destinies, operating according to reason and making free choices, I think has been to a certain extent undermined by science. And I think that science can be threatening to our self-images in lots of other ways. And it's not it's not as bad as some people think it would be without religion, of course. But I think we have to face that. Now, in this case, it's even clearer that we just have to face it, because the alternatives are just completely untenable. People who seek salvation from science through religious belief basically have to hang on to things which is just entirely untenable. I mean, so for example, take the soul, for example, self and soul. You know, I'll plug my latest book. I talk about this. You know, how the self, there is no abiding permanent core of self. The self is something which emerges from a complex interactions of thoughts, feelings, processes, and body, and so forth. And given that we are biologically rooted, that seems to knock immortality on the head, and life after death is ruled out of the question. That's a bit of a challenge, right? This is really ultimately science telling us this. I think philosophy tells us a lot about how to understand it properly, actually. And a lot of philosophies got there first before science came along and confirmed it. But, you know, science is telling us these things about ourselves. That is sobering. Religion offers the promise of a salvation from that. Offers the promise that despite what science is telling us, it's not true that we don't have free will. It's not true that there's no life after death because X, Y, Z. Unfortunately, I haven't got time to go into them. The contortions you have to go into in order to argue that are completely untenable. So in this, as in other things, I think, as everything else I've said, it's a question of acceptance. But, and I think this is a point I want to stress, I think it's an important thing to be open about. I think that there is a tendency, perhaps, to be too optimistic about what science says, to present the growth of scientific knowledge as something which is all good and doesn't tell us anything uncomfortable about ourselves. And I think we do science a bit of a disservice. And I think we sort of do, going back to how I opened up, really, I think we kind of do humanism a disservice if we gloss over those things. What did I say at the beginning? What I said at the beginning was that we have to accept the fact that our whole self-image is based around being critical, scrutinizing, open, honest, and rational. And I think to do those things, we have to also accept that there are implications of what we believe which are not comfortable, which do leave us more exposed, do leave us more vulnerable than we might otherwise have been. That's the price we pay for actually following the truth where it leads, rather than going with other things. So I just finished with this. I don't know why, because I wanted a picture at the end. Not quite. This is a surfer, of course. Surfing, I thought, was a kind of a bit of a metaphor for life, isn't it? You know, the surfer is someone who is embracing life, is making the most of it, is finding something truly worth doing. The surfer has a reason to get up in the morning and live. But, you know, we have to recognize the fact that the surfer's predicament is one which is not entirely comfortable. That moments of true elation and transcendence are fleeting. They spend a lot of time out there trying to catch the perfect wave for those few moments in which it all comes together and everything seems right. When they do, it's short-lived and they come crashing down. And of course, even the best surfer, age catches up with them and they hang up their surfboard and have to go there. You know, I think we have to accept with honesty the fact that life without God is, in a sense, like this, and it has its joys, it has its exhilarations, it has its things which make it worthwhile. But if we don't accept the fleetingness and the fragility and the limitations of that life, I don't think we're being honest to ourselves, and I don't think actually we're, in terms of convincing people of the merits of our case, I think if we gloss over those things, we look like we're evasive and denying the truth rather than championing the truth, which is what we should be. Oh, and there's an advert for my book. Thank you very much.
Well, I thought that was wonderful. It's helped me make sense a little bit of the journey I've been through since I left religion. Anyway, I'm torn because I'd love to keep Julian here for ages having debate, and I know lunch is out there, so I propose that maybe we have 5 minutes extra just for a couple of questions, and then Julian will be around over lunch and we'll have individual conversations with him. Okay, there's someone halfway down in the red shirt.
Yeah, forgiveness isn't again, it's one of those ones that I think with lots of these things, we can come back and say, well, no, there are routes to forgiveness. It's not something they have a monopoly on, but again, it makes it perhaps easier. But again, no, I think what's interesting, there's a very interesting radio program made recently by a woman. You would have heard about the woman who left the clergy of the Church of England because her daughter was killed in the London bombings. And she just found that in that situation she was unable to forgive. She was unable to what she was supposed to do. So there are always prices on the other side. I haven't focused on the prices on the other side. Okay, and there are. I think the commitment to forgiveness can lead people to sort of feel an inappropriate obligation to forgive, where perhaps it's inappropriate to do so and unrealistic to do so. But yeah, in general, I think the capacity to forgive is one of the original, one of the great. I think when people say Jesus wasn't the Son of God, but he was a great moral teacher, I think they overstate that. Actually, I'm not sure he was a great moral teacher. A lot of his stuff was not particularly, but I think the forgiveness thing was an important innovation of Christian morality, which I think that we could take up on. Yeah.
Yes, you point, because I can't see through the
Okay.
lights.
I don't know who was. Do you know who was first? We got three there. I'll tell you what. Why don't we get these three people each to make their comment, and we'll see if there's time. So these three hands and the two people behind you.
I just want to completely disagree with you about the belonging and community being the preserve of the religious world.
Not the preserve.
And also the transcendence thing. I'm a breast cancer patient, and I'm involved with a number of breast cancer charities. And you've got the moonwalk, and you've got, the level of involvement and community that you get, and it's nothing whatsoever to do with religion, and it's all to do with doing something that is greater than ourselves. And I really, really think that you do the non-religious community a terrible disservice by what you said. I think it's a natural human desire to do something greater than ourselves.
Okay, do you want to pass to the back?
And I think you get transcendence for doing it.
Yeah, could you give the mic to the two people behind? We'll take the three comments together.
Hi, Julian. I just wanted to ask you quickly, do you agree with Sam Harris that science can determine human moral values?
Thank you. And the guy next to you?
I just wanted to ask you about gratitude. You mentioned the example of food, and I was wondering whether the ritual of prayer, being grateful for food, for example, might actually, rather lead towards selfishness. If by definition you are grateful, you have to have something to be grateful for. In this particular instance, food. If you live in a country where you have no access to food, it might lead to a thinking process of, well, thank God I have food here, but I won't go there to live. If, on the other hand, you have an expectation of food every day, as I do, then I can extrapolate that expectation to the countries who don't have the food available and demand on their behalf that there ought to be food available to them.
Okay, thanks for those. I'll try and deal with all three briefly because I think you're going to be grateful for lunch when it comes. The first one, community. I must say, I think you just got me wrong. I didn't say that community was the preserver of religion. I explicitly did not say that. I said that, and I also said I predicted your contribution in a way. I said I'm sure there are plenty of people in this room who will be able to point to particular communities they are members of, which are strong examples. So I'm in no way saying that a religious community is always superior, or that community and belonging is a preserve of religions, or that there aren't forms of community, often based around voluntary action and help and stuff, which are, as good or better. I wasn't saying that at all. What I was saying was simply that there is, on average, typically, if you like, I think there is a form of community which is available to the religious one, which is more easily and more readily, and that people can slot into like that. So it's not quite as you put it, I'm afraid. On Sam Harris and whether science can determine human values, the short answer is no. I don't think science can determine human values. There are cameras here, so I won't be too. Can I refer you to? I wrote something on the. I did an interview with Sam Harris for the Independent, which you can read online, and it's mildly critical. But I think if you read that, you'll see what my own concerns about Sam Harris's position are. They fairly clearly do come out, although I'm not really expressing my view very strongly. The point that the truth of the core Sam Harris's thing, out of which I think other things are hung which don't get sustained, is that if indeed it is true that people think that we learn nothing about values by understanding facts about the world, they are mistaken. But I just don't think people think that anymore. There's a very sort of it's about 80 years out of date in terms of Oxford philosophy, even to think that, that people maintain that strict division between facts and values. And the gratitude example there, well, the thing is, there's always more than one way people can go with these things. It's like the forgiveness example, there's not a one-to-one relationship between a particular way of thinking or value and what people make of it. It is possible to have a sense of gratitude and for it to have a malign effect. So for example, I'm thankful about this, we should all be thankful, and why are we thankful? Because it's the will of God, and therefore we don't have to worry about what other people have or not. We're thankful. If they don't have it, that's for them to argue with their God with. But I think in general, I think if you, on the whole, and in general, feelings of gratitude are more, benevolent forces than malevolent forces in the world. But of course, it's possible that in a particular case, they wouldn't be. All right?
Can I just say thank you very much. I'm not apologetic for taking 10 minutes out of your lunch break to enable us to have 10 minutes more of your thoughts. I appreciate it very much. So, thank you.